In August 1947, a state health inspector named Dr. Marion Huxley arrived at a farmhouse in rural Appomattox County, Virginia, carrying a leather satchel and a court order. He'd been dispatched by the Commonwealth's Bureau of Vital Statistics after a local midwife filed an anonymous complaint, one so disturbing that it had been escalated directly to the governor's desk. The complaint was simple. A girl had given birth in that house. The father's name on the makeshift birth record was left blank, and according to the midwife's sworn statement, the girl's brother had been seen entering her bedroom every night for nearly a year. Dr. Huxley found the girl sitting on a porch rocker, nursing an infant with a face that didn't look quite right. Her name was Claudette Morrell. She was 19 years old. The baby's eyes were set too far apart, and its skull had a subtle flattening at the crown, classic markers of severe consanguinity. When Huxley asked who the father was, Claudette stared at him for a long moment, then said, "My brother took care of me. Daddy said it was the only way to keep the name pure." Inside the house, Huxley found something worse. A family Bible with a handwritten genealogy that looped back on itself like a knot. Marriages between first cousins, siblings sharing children, a bloodline that hadn't seen an outsider in 4 generations. What followed became one of the most quietly suppressed cases in Virginia's legal history. A story buried in sealed court files, redacted medical reports, and a single photograph that was never meant to be seen. Before we go further, subscribe and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Stories like this survive only because people refuse to let them be forgotten. The Morrell family had lived in the Blue Ridge foothills since before the Civil War. Their original homestead, a 2-story timber house with a stone foundation, sat on 63 acres of rocky land unsuitable for tobacco or corn. They raised goats. They kept to themselves. And according to county records, they almost never left. Census data from 1880 through 1940 tells a strange story. The Morrell household fluctuated between 4 and 9 people, but the surnames never changed. No Morrell woman ever took a different last name. No outside men ever moved onto the property. In the 1920 census, a clerk noted in the margin, "Family refuses to answer questions regarding parentage." By 1930, the head of the household was a man named Virgil Morrell, Claudette's grandfather. He had married his first cousin, Nadine, in 1902. Together, they had 6 children. 3 survived past infancy. According to baptismal records from the nearby Methodist church, 2 of those children, Ezra and Dinah, were married to each other in 1924. Ezra was 21. Dinah was 16. They were full siblings. No one intervened. The church minister, Reverend Amos Whitlock, later claimed he didn't know they were related. But his personal journal, recovered in 1953, tells a different story. In an entry dated June 1924, he wrote, "Virgil Morrell came to me and insisted I marry his son to his daughter. He said it was God's will that the bloodline remain unbroken. I objected. He said if I refused, they would do it themselves in the woods, without the Lord's blessing. I prayed over it. I performed the ceremony. I have sinned." Ezra and Dinah had 4 children. Claudette was the eldest. Her younger brother Jacob was born 2 years later in 1930. By the time Claudette was 16, their parents were dead. Dinah from tuberculosis, Ezra from a logging accident. The children were left in the care of Virgil, their grandfather, who by then was in his 70s and increasingly unhinged. According to a visiting nurse's report from 1945, Virgil believed his family was chosen by God and that mixing with outsiders would poison the blood. It was Virgil who decided that Claudette and Jacob should produce a child together. Dr. Marion Huxley's official report, filed on September 3, 1947, is one of the most harrowing documents in Virginia's public health archives. It was sealed for 30 years and only declassified in 1977 under a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a genealogist studying Appalachian endogamy. Huxley's findings were methodical and devastating. The infant, whom Claudette had named Samuel, displayed multiple congenital abnormalities: microcephaly, a cleft palate, and underdeveloped lungs. He weighed 4 pounds at 2 months old. Huxley estimated the child had a 50% chance of surviving to age 5. But Samuel wasn't the first. In a back bedroom, Huxley found a cedar chest containing 3 small burial gowns, each embroidered with initials and dates. The earliest was from 1944, when Claudette would have been just 16. The midwife later admitted, under oath, that Claudette had delivered at least 2 other children before Samuel. Both had died within days. One had no nasal bridge. The other never opened its eyes. Huxley interviewed Claudette alone. She spoke in a flat, detached voice, as though recounting someone else's life. She said her grandfather told her it was her duty, that Jacob was the only man she was allowed to know, that if she refused, Virgil would burn her mother's grave and cast her out of the family. When Huxley asked if she loved Jacob, Claudette said, "He's my brother. I don't know what love is supposed to feel like." Jacob, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. According to a neighbor, he'd left the property 3 days before Huxley arrived, carrying a rucksack and a rifle. He was never seen again. But the inspection report wasn't the only record, because in the county coroner's files, another detail had surfaced, one that suggested the Morrell story was darker, older, and far more deliberate than anyone had suspected. In October 1947, a county clerk named Phyllis Crane was going through old land deeds when she found a leather-bound ledger tucked inside a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in decades. The ledger belonged to Virgil Morrell's father, a man named Thaddeus, who had died in 1911. It was a breeding log. The entries spanned from 1885 to 1909 and were written in meticulous, slanted handwriting. Each page listed a pairing, a date, and an outcome. The pairings were always between blood relatives. The outcomes were clinical. Cousin Abigail to Cousin Roland, 1887. Male child, stillborn, skull malformation. Sister Constance to Brother Elijah, 1891. Female child, lived 14 months, seizures. Daughter Miriam to Father Thaddeus, 1896. Male child, lived 6 years, mental deficiency. Thaddeus Morrell had been experimenting with inbreeding for over 2 decades, attempting to purify the bloodline through selective coupling. His notes revealed a twisted logic. He believed that repeated consanguineous unions would eventually produce a child of divine clarity, one free from weakness, disease, or moral corruption. It never worked. Every child either died young or suffered severe disabilities. But Thaddeus kept trying. And when he passed the farm to his son Virgil, he passed on the ideology too. Phyllis Crane turned the ledger over to the state police. An investigation was opened. But the Morrell case had already become a political nightmare. Virginia was still reeling from the fallout of its forced sterilization program, which had rendered thousands of people infertile under the guise of eugenics. The last thing the Commonwealth wanted was another scandal involving bloodline purity and state-sanctioned abuse. The case was quietly closed. The ledger was reclassified as evidence in a pending matter and locked away. Claudette and Samuel were placed in state custody. Virgil Morrell was never charged. He died of a stroke 3 months later. And the house, it was left to rot. In 1953, a freelance journalist named Helen Driscoll drove out to the old Morrell property, hoping to write a feature on America's forgotten families. She found the farmhouse still standing, though the roof had partially collapsed and the windows were shattered. Inside, she found photographs. They were scattered across the floor of what had once been the parlor, dozens of them, sepia-toned and water-stained. Most showed the same group of people across multiple generations: severe-faced men and hollow-eyed women, children with strange proportions, families arranged in stiff, unnatural poses. But one photograph stood out. It showed a girl, no older than 15, in a white nightgown, standing in front of a mirror. Behind her, just visible in the reflection, was a man with his hand on her shoulder. The girl's expression was blank. The man's face was obscured, but his hand was unmistakable. Long fingers, a thick signet ring, a posture of ownership. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, Dinah, 1918, the first. Dinah was Claudette's mother. The man in the reflection was almost certainly her father, Virgil. Helen Driscoll never published her article. She later told a colleague that the photographs made her feel sick for weeks. She donated them to the Virginia Historical Society, where they remain in a restricted archive to this day. But the photographs weren't the only thing Helen found, because in the cellar, beneath a false floor, she discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Helen Driscoll didn't intend to go down into the cellar. The stairs were rotted, and the air smelled of mildew and something sharper, something chemical. But she'd seen a gap in the floor near the base of the stairs, and when she shone her flashlight through it, she saw bones. Small bones. She pried up the boards. Beneath them was a shallow crawl space, barely 3 feet deep, lined with red clay. Inside were the remains of at least 6 infants, wrapped in decaying cloth and arranged in a neat row. Some had visible deformities, elongated skulls, fused ribs, limbs that bent at unnatural angles. There was no record of these children, no death certificates, no graves. They had been hidden deliberately and left to decompose in silence. Helen reported her findings to the county sheriff, who dispatched a forensic team. The remains were exhumed and examined by a state pathologist named Dr. Leonard Kirby. His report, filed in November 1953, concluded that the infants had died over a span of at least 40 years. The oldest remains dated back to the 1890s. The newest were from the early 1940s. All of them showed signs of severe genetic defects, consistent with repeated close-kin reproduction. Dr. Kirby's report included a chilling addendum. It is my professional opinion that these children were not the result of accidental inbreeding, but of deliberate, sustained efforts to produce offspring between siblings, parents and children, and other first-degree relatives. The Morrell family did not simply tolerate incest. They practiced it as a form of ritual. The question is not why these children died, but why the family continued to produce them, knowing the outcomes. The answer, Kirby suggested, was ideological. The Morrells believed they were preserving something sacred, a bloodline untainted by the outside world, and they were willing to sacrifice their children to do it. But the cellar wasn't the end of the story, because in 1961, a woman came forward claiming to be Claudette Morrell's daughter, and she brought with her a letter that changed everything. The woman's name was Grace Farrow. She was 14 years old, living in a group home in Richmond. She told a social worker that her mother, Claudette, had written her a letter before disappearing in 1959. Grace had kept it hidden for 2 years, afraid of what it meant. The letter was 3 pages long, written in shaky cursive on lined paper. In it, Claudette described her childhood in halting, fragmented sentences. She wrote about her grandfather's obsession with purity, about the night Virgil locked her and Jacob in a bedroom together and told them they wouldn't be let out until they fulfilled God's design, about the shame and confusion that followed. But the most disturbing part of the letter came near the end. Grace, I need you to know that you're not like Samuel. You're not like the others. Your father wasn't Jacob. I lied to the inspector because Virgil told me to. Your father was a man I met in town when I was 17, a stranger. Virgil found out. He beat me so badly I couldn't walk for a week, but I kept you secret. I kept you safe. You're the only one who got out with clean blood. Don't ever go looking for the rest of the family. There's nothing left but ghosts. If Claudette was telling the truth, then the child the inspector examined, Samuel, was not Grace's brother. Grace was conceived outside the bloodline, hidden from Virgil, and born in secret before Claudette was forced back into her grandfather's grip. But Grace's existence raised another question. If Claudette managed to escape once, why didn't she run? The answer came from a deposition filed in 1948 during a custody hearing. A neighbor named Ruth Calloway testified that Virgil Morrell kept his granddaughter under lock and that she'd seen Claudette chained to a bedpost on more than one occasion. Ruth claimed she'd reported it to local authorities, but nothing was done. The sheriff at the time later admitted he'd been paid by Virgil to stay off the property. Claudette wasn't just a victim of incest, she was a prisoner. Claudette Morrell was released from state custody in 1950 at the age of 22. She moved to Norfolk, changed her name, and worked as a seamstress. She rarely spoke about her past. According to a landlord who knew her in the 1950s, she was quiet, nervous, and always looking over her shoulder. In 1959, she vanished. Her apartment was found abandoned, the door unlocked, a half-finished dress still on the sewing table. No one ever reported her missing. No body was ever found. Samuel, her son, was placed in a state institution for children with developmental disabilities. He died in 1963 at the age of 16 from pneumonia. His death certificate listed no next of kin. Grace Farrow, the daughter Claudette saved, grew up in foster care. She later became a nurse and moved to Maryland, where she raised a family of her own. In a 2003 interview with a local historian, she said she'd spent years trying to forget the Morrell name. But every time she looked at her own children, healthy, happy, untouched by the curse, she thought of her mother. "She gave me a chance," Grace said. "She broke the cycle, even if it killed her." The Morrell farmhouse was demolished in 1967. The land was sold to a timber company. No memorial was ever erected. No graves were marked. But the case left a mark on Virginia's legal system. In 1968, the state passed one of the nation's strictest anti-incest laws, closing loopholes that had allowed cases like the Morrells to be ignored. The law was nicknamed Claudette's Law by the legislators who drafted it, though her name never appeared in the official text. And the ledger? It resurfaced briefly in 1989 when a researcher petitioned to have it released for academic study. The petition was denied. The ledger remains sealed. There's a darker thread to the Morrell case, one that's never been fully explained. In 1972, a former FBI agent named Douglas Lattimore published a memoir in which he claimed to have investigated secretive inbreeding cults in rural America during the 1940s and 50s. He described families who practiced ritualized incest as a form of religious devotion, believing that blood purity would bring them closer to God. According to Lattimore, these families were often protected by local officials, sheriffs, judges, even clergy, who either shared their beliefs or were paid to look the other way. Lattimore never named the Morrells directly, but his description matched their case almost exactly. He also claimed that some of these families were part of a loose network, exchanging letters and lineage records, convinced they were preserving an ancient bloodline. In 1995, a box of letters was discovered in an estate sale in North Carolina. The letters, dated between 1930 and 1947, were addressed to Brother Virgil and signed by various pseudonyms. They discussed purification, divine offspring, and the coming child. One letter dated 1946 read, "Brother Virgil, we grieve for your losses, but we urge you to continue. The vessel must be perfected. The impure must be discarded. Only through persistence will we achieve the design." The letters were never authenticated, but they suggest the Morrells weren't acting alone, that their ideology was part of something larger, older, and more organized than anyone suspected. If that's true, then Claudette was just one victim in a network of horrors stretching across the Appalachian backwoods, hidden in plain sight. The Morrell case is not a ghost story. It's not folklore. It's a matter of public record, buried, yes, but never erased. Claudette's life was stolen from her by a family that believed blood mattered more than humanity. She carried a child conceived in captivity, lost others to deformity and death, and vanished without a trace into a world that never offered her safety. The bloodline is gone now. The house is gone. The name is gone. But in the hills of Appomattox County, There are still people who remember when the state inspector came, when the bones were found, when the family Bible was burned on the courthouse steps. They remember the girl who never smiled, the brother who disappeared, and the grandfather who believed he could breed perfection out of ruin. They remember, and they don't talk about it. Because some stories aren't meant to be told out loud. They're meant to be whispered late at night when you're sure no one is listening. And somewhere, in a sealed file in Richmond, a ledger still waits.